Welcome to In the Shadow of Duce podcast, a podcast on change and legacies in Italy. I am your host Diego, and in the next 2 episodes we will talk about the fascist attempt to indoctrinate the population and create a national consensus behind fascism. In 2014, Matteo Renzi, the then Prime Minister of Italy, announced Rome's bid for the 2024 Olympics inside the Foro Italico, or Foro Mussolini. He announced his bid standing in front of the Apophysis of Fascism, a painting depicting Mussolini as an all-powerful god surrounded by loyal Italians. Just imagine if Merkel had done the same in Germany, backdropped by some Nazi-era architecture. Foro Mussolini and the painting represent a legacy of a campaign of indoctrination that occurred over 90 years ago. It was a campaign to ensure Italians' undying loyalty to fascism. It expanded the regime into every corner of Italian life, leaving no Italian untouched with its malign influence. Film, radio and sport soon became the tools of choice for fascism in its quest to become part of Italian identity. An identity left scarred for decades to come. A couple of episodes back, we talked about what fascist totalitarianism was. We talked about how it was built on 2 pillars, and we focused on the pillar related to the state. However, an equally, if not more important pillar was the indoctrination or the inquadramento of the nation. This involved converting normal Italians into fascist Italians. Good old oppression, whilst it would allow the regime to survive in the near future, would not be a long-term solution. If fascism wanted to embed itself in history, it needed to become the culture and belief system that Italians would identify to. This is why fascism became quasi-religious. It would become Italians' new Catholicism, creating an all-inclusive value system and in controlling every aspect of their lives. It needed to mobilize the population whilst reforming and molding it into fascism image. This would become the process of inquadramento, a process largely delegated to the PNF. Fascism made extensive use of the media and culture to andare verso il popolo, or go towards the people. Fascism adopted a very broad and totalitarian definition of culture. Culture was to them a set of values, a conception and a way of life. It was supposed to be permeated into all areas of an Italian's existence. Culture was to impart fascism's values to the people and thus deliver the people to the service of the state. It is important to note that fascist culture merged intellectual and abstract art with popular culture enjoyed by the masses. Here the media played a very important role. Tools such as the press, radio, cinema and sport helped to indoctrinate Italians with the values of fascism and deliver their services to the state. The press was censored heavily. Mussolini didn't really care about who owned the newspaper, but rather what was actually written in them. His press office sent out detailed instructions on what to print and how to print it. Soon enough, the newspapers were full of relentless fascist rhetoric, and any reports of crime or suicide or traffic accidents were scrubbed. However, this led to their emasculation rather than indoctrination. Many Italians continued reading their old newspapers. In 1933, the Corriere della Sera had a circulation of over 600,000, compared to the fascist Popolo d'Italia, which only had 100,000. Radio was more successful. By 1938, there were over 1 million registered sets, and each set were listened to by multiple people, gathered in living rooms, cafes, and even whole piazze around Italy. This proved to be an excellent opportunity to spread propaganda and indoctrinate the populace. However, the greatest innovation of the regime was cinema. Cinema was promoted heavily and many cinemas were built across Italy and her colonies. In 1924, Luce, or l'Unione Cinematografica Educativa, was created to produce documentaries and newsreels. Most films shown in cinemas were actually American, and though there were some successful fascist films, most Italian films remained escapist historical dramas not necessarily linked with the regime. To spread its propaganda and make itself felt in Italians' leisure time, newsreels were made compulsory at every showing. Fascism thus used media extensively to gain a route to many Italians' private lives, penetrating their private sphere to indoctrinate them. However, the most successful way to indoctrinate people was through the party's capillary organization. In 1925, local leisure clubs were federated into a national network, or the Opera Nazionale Dopolavoro, the OND. The movement was humongous in scale, with nearly 2 million members in 1931 and 4 million by 1939. Most clubs are organised on a commune basis or local basis, but the OND also managed to persuade some 3,000 industrial firms to set up recreation schemes. The Dopolavoro clubs had bars, libraries and billiard halls. They organised summer holidays, hikes and days at the sea. A quick look at the Luce archives reveals the plethora of activities on show. There were hikes in Piemonte or Val d'Aosta. There were trips to local airports to marvel and examine aircraft. There were organised marathons around the 7 hills of Rome. The only organised mass leisure activities never seen in Italian history. In Siena alone, by 1937, there were over 204 OND centres. The OND often made use of local festivals and regional folklore in their activities. By combining the local, the national and the fascist, the regime was one step closer in their goal of nationalizing Italians. In Siena, the Fasci Litorali were combined into the Palio of Siena, the banner given to the winner of the annual horse race there. This represented the careful interweaving of long-standing traditions and the immediate requirements of the regime. The youth was also organized into fascist organizations such as the ONB, which became the GIL in 1937. These were youth clubs with sport facilities and taught an education of war. They paraded around in military uniforms as fascism prepared them to be chucked into the meat grinder of future wars. The OND also allowed fascism to penetrate into another activity: sport. As fascist deputy and newspaper editor Lando Ferretti said, "Sport is, for fascism, above all a school for the will, which will prepare citizens in peace to be heroic soldiers for fascism in wartime." Sport was thus often linked to war. A poster for the 1936 Olympics shows this perfectly: an athlete throwing a javelin, backdropped by a soldier in uniform throwing a grenade, highlighting how fascism sought to change Italians through the medium of sport. The cult of Mussolini focused a lot on sport. Mussolini was shown skiing bare-chested as Superman who the Italians should seek to emulate. The years of fascism were also the years of spectacle for Italian sport. Racing cars raced around Monza at full speed, Balbo flew across the Atlantic, and sleek Italian planes broke speed world records left and right. Cycling also became a very popular sport and was propagandized heavily, yet the greatest exploit was football. New soccer clubs were created and huge stadiums were built. Italians would become a sports nation and fascism would slowly seep into people's lives. Football also helped create one national Italian identity, both before and after World War II. The nature of football symbolically represented unity, that fascism strove for, with 11 players all working together to get a ball in the opposition's goal. The victories in the 1934 and 38 World Cup would provide a massive propaganda boost for the fascist regime. The regime had certainly succeeded in involving large amounts of the population in their activities. It was a great vehicle for the indoctrination of the populace and allowed fascism to be turned into a permanent presence in many Italians' lives. This seriously amplified the legacy of fascism in Italy by making sure fascism remained a presence in the Italian conscience. The ideas of mass also had many legacies. In post-war Italy, an identity based on privatization was hurriedly pursued as a counterweight to the fascist idea of the masses. But whilst they may have had many legacies and impacts, the OND and other organizations didn't really indoctrinate Italians. It was fun, not propaganda. It was recreation and not self-improvement. It maintained a largely neutral approach, a fact lamented by many fascists. In the Dopolavoro, people did very much the same things they did in the old socialist Casa del Popolo. There was nothing necessarily fascist about the Dopolavoro. It was called by some disgusted fascists the Opera Nazionale delle Ostiere, or the National Organization for Tavern, as Italians spent more time drinking than swallowing fascist ideals. Fascism had always been obsessed with the amount of action and activity rather than the actual quality of it. Fascists had deluded themselves with their conviction that activity could serve as a substitute for politics, and thus the unpolitical remained the unpolitical. The tug of war remained the tug of war, and not some sort of fascist ritual. The Dopolavoro did not strengthen the regime in the long run or create a nation of fascists. It did not strengthen unity and solve cross-class divides at all, as workers and the middle class largely carried out their activities separately. The youth clubs were subverted by the influence the church and family both had. Catholic action continued to exist, protected by the Pope, and the youth presented little interest in fascism. The youth were often described as smoking, laughing, and generally being a nuisance in the middle of group proceedings. The Diary of a 16-year-old Girl in 1940 presents this feeling by saying that the fascist organizations and education had only filled our heads with smoke. With fascism's organizations failing to do much to nationalize Italians, the regime resorted to their truly tried and tested method of oppression. If fascism could destroy effective opposition and scare Italians into submission, then fascism could claim to have created consensus. The opposition, as we have already spoken about, was effectively crushed, and real effective opposition was relegated to outside Italy's borders. Violence also played its part. Violence didn't subside, but rather remained constant and an increasingly important tool for control. Fascists were particularly sensitive to behaviour that was seen as dismissive to the regime. In Padua in 1937, 2 old men were beaten up for inadvertently failing to take their hats off as a military march passed on by, and many assumed criminals magically fell out of windows to their deaths. Fascism's control of welfare and other forms of social security allowed it to potentially block access to anyone who stepped out of line. The withdrawal of union card or work permits for not only the offender but also the entire family could have catastrophic consequences. Ovra and its systems of informants and spies also constantly listened in on Italians, and local neighborhood groups created a cartelle di famiglia with details of every family living in the local area. Fear thus became an effective tool to construct a fascist consensus. Fear would ensure that Italians would at least conform to their new realities and accept that their freedoms were long-lost relics. However, fear doesn't make people's wages go up or make people want to join in on the national community. In fact, it just made people, especially the working class, more resentful. Colonial conquest and especially the Spanish intervention, alongside economic depression, had hit the Italian economy and people hard. By the late 1930s, resentment and disgust was growing in a population that had suffered so much for so little. Fascist consensus was supposed to be innovative, something beyond oppression, but did a full 360 back to where it started. As we can probably see, fascism's push to consensus was a failure. The fascist regime failed miserably to gain the Italian people's faith and trust. This would spell the end of the regime. A regime that does not have the true backing of the people is a regime doomed to fail. The regime failed to instill even the basic values of patriotism and nationalism within its population, meaning that, on a whole, the Italian army, apart from a few units such as the Folgore Paratrooper Division or the Ariete Tank Division, performed abysmally. Italian soldiers rightfully preferred to save their own lives by surrendering over some inglorious death in the middle of a desert in Libya. As Allied bombers relentlessly pounded northern Italy and Allied troops rushed ashore onto Sicily, fascism crumbled. The causes of failure are many. However, they can be summed up in three sections: PNF weaknesses, existing subcultures, and economic issues. The PNF had been weakened significantly throughout the regime. The initial period of normalization had served to severely dilute the more innovative and proactive side of fascism, and the purges of the party had left it in largely conservative hands. The cult of hierarchy and discipline which overtook the party produced passivity among the faithful and fostered an attitude of conformism and keeping your mouth shut. This lack of initiative was made worse by the constant infighting between basically everyone in the fascist regime. Fascism had been a compromise, and this compromise soon broke down as competing factions fought over everything and anything. This led to a serious loss of direction amongst many local fascist leaders, and generated political distance between the leaders and the led, which impaired the transmission of fascist ideology. To fascists, personal power assumed greater importance than ideology, as more and more time was spent insulting and plotting than actually getting anything done. The party had also done a good job at angering everybody. It managed to anger the business elite, the middle class, the army, the working class. A disliked and weakened party cannot efficiently transmit its values onto the people. The second reason for failure is the existence of competing subcultures. Fascism was certainly not the only subculture that existed in Italy at the time. The monarchy and its institutions resonated strongly within fascist Italy and undermined any attempts to totally control Italian society. The monarchy provided Italians and the elite with a different set of values compared to fascism, which was rapidly getting more radical and desperate. Fascism, for example, struggled immensely to solidify themselves in Piemonte, where the House of Savoy ruled before unification in 1861. Furthermore, many Italians preferred to identify themselves with their local region and family rather than the regime. Children were arguably more affected by their parents' view than their teachers, and the idea of a national Italian identity was foreign to most. Many still spoke in dialect, and no regime policy could change this fact. However, the greatest subculture that subverted the regime was the church. Catholicism had its own value and belief system quite incompatible with that of fascism. It held immense influence in education and welfare, and unlike democratic institutions, couldn't simply be smashed. Although the church, for the most part, cooperated with some serious disagreements along the way, the church was a rival, and a rival who actually strengthened throughout the years. By the 1930s, there was a religious revival, especially in the north and centre. Church marriages became ever more common, and Catholic Action had over 1 million members. These organisations, while tactically cooperating with the regime, imparted a different culture to that of fascism, which overall helped to kill any real attempts to gain a consensus. The post-war attempts and successes by the Christian Democrats to embed themselves in the system was largely won through the support of the church. This failure to properly convert Italians into loyal fascists meant that the regime struggled immensely just before the dawn of the war. Dopolavoro and sport wouldn't change the fact that Italians were poorer and more hard-pressed. Wages had gone down throughout the period, and combined with depression, many Italians were feeling the squeeze. Opposition was beginning to grow. In 1937, a battalion made up of Italian exiles called the Garibaldi Battalion routed the fascist volunteer corps at the Battle of Guadalajara during the Spanish Civil War, inflicting heavy casualties. Rossellini, a famous anti-fascist exile, had a slogan of "Today in Spain, tomorrow in Italy." It began to be seen on walls around Italy, a sign of growing discontent for an out-of-touch and out-of-time regime. Rossellini's slogan would turn out to be true. The Spanish Civil War, its violence and its brutality, was just a rehearsal for things to come in Italy.